Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As a coach, I will go into schools and I'm tasked to help teachers to nail down what effective instruction looks like. And here in the United States, there are a couple of frameworks that most schools use. One of the more prominent ones is the Danielson framework, which looks at teacher preparation, instruction, classroom environment, and professional responsibilities. But one of the challenges of Danielson, it's a very good framework, but one of the challenges is it can be pretty dense. It includes rubrics, it's very wordy, and sometimes it can be overwhelming for teachers. It's not the only framework that's out there. There are several frameworks out there in terms of what makes effective instruction effective. Today, I'm really excited to have as guest Tom Sherrington. Tom is an educator out of the UK. He is one of the founders of WALKTHRUs, which is another way of looking at what effective instruction is and should be. Tom has a wealth of experience as a former head teacher or principal, as we would say here in the States. And so I'm really excited to talk to Tom about what effective instruction is and how this all fits in with his framework for effective instruction walkthroughs. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, John. I'm really delighted to be talking to your listeners and to you.
Glad to have you. I know you're a busy man doing a lot of work in schools, both in the UK and other places as well. Tom, before we even get into things, can you tell us a little bit more about who you are, your background, and how instructional evaluation or effective instruction became your area of focus?
Sure, it's nice to talk about all these things. I was a teacher for a long time, as a physics and maths teacher mainly, then became a school principal in a few schools. I worked in schools for about 30 years altogether. And then I left that to support schools more as in a consultancy role. And I realized the thing I enjoyed the most about my work, even as a principal, was really training teachers to improve their practices. I love watching lessons and then having great conversations with teachers afterwards about their practice. I specialized in helping school leaders to support instructional development. Alongside that, I was writing about it. So I have a blog called teacherhead.com. To my astonishment, there's an interest in ideas about teaching, which are quite prosaic, sort of everyday things like marking books or asking questions in class. And teachers are interested in to discuss these things. So those things came together through the books that I've then written about teaching. And the walkthroughs came about through my partner, Oliver Caviglioli, who's also a former principal of a special education school. And he had a real interest in graphic design as well. And he felt the big problem with a lot of books about teaching is that they're too dense, a bit like the Danielson framework you mentioned. And teachers are too busy to really read a lot of the books. They just are too busy. So he said, why don't we try to capture all these great ideas that we share about teaching in a visual way, a 5-step guide. A walkthrough for us means a step-by-step guide. And he got the idea from the US tech world where you might have a walkthrough for a software program, make a sofa from IKEA or something. It means a step-by-step guide. We know now that there's a confusion in the US with a walkthrough, meaning an admin or a senior leader walking through lessons to check up on teachers. But that isn't what we mean, actually. We don't mean that. We mean a walkthrough, meaning a step-by-step guide to a thing. That's what's taken off. This sort of visual guide to everyday teaching practices has become our thing, and work with schools to use that tool to support their professional development.
I did have a chance to see some of those visuals, and I like the analogy you gave to IKEA because I think that will hit home for a lot of Americans. Can you, excuse the pun, walk us through how walkthroughs is set up? Because again, having looked at some of those visuals, I do find them very concise and clear in terms of the steps that a teacher could take or should take to be quote unquote effective in how they're doing that certain thing.
Basically, I've done training on this many, many times on all these things. And some of the ideas are taken from Doug Lamoff's Teach Like a Champion. Some are taken from my own ideas, borrowed from other areas. They're just well-known ideas. Take something like a turn and talk, or we call it think, pair, share, which is another one, like a classic turn to your partner. How do you make it so that both children in a pair have to talk and share? You break them down into steps. So the first thing you need to do is make sure everyone has a talk partner. And that sounds so obvious. We spell out the obvious. We're never above the obvious in teaching. Lessons stand or fall on doing really obvious things really well. If I want to make sure everyone has a talk partner, I have to do that. Then you have to pose a question which has got some structure to it, because if you're going to have pair talk, a simple question will get a simple answer, and that's not really worth discussing. So you have a question which has got a bit of structure to it, like coming up with 3 advantages and 3 disadvantages or something specific like that, and a bit of a time frame for that so the children know how long they have to talk. A third step is that you then give the children thinking time on their own first. So before they share their ideas, they've got to think of their own. Otherwise, one child just hears the other's ideas first and it stops them thinking, in fact. So thinking on your own, then share. The fourth step is the teacher then circulates as the children are sharing so that they can listen in and check it's happening and get some sense of what the children are talking about. And the fifth step is that you then pool the answers into the collective, the whole class, through cold calling, so that the teacher selects children and says, hey, so John, what were you saying in your pair? How did you get on? And invites the children to share certain answers. So that's the structure. And when you break it down in that way, you go beyond just saying, am I doing turn and talks? Yes, I am. Is it going well? Yes, it is. It's much more precise than that. Who are the talk partners? Are they effective? What questions are good for think, pair, share? Was it a good question? Could I have asked a more deep question? How many children did I select at the end? When I was listening in, were they able to follow the conversation? And all sorts of things like that. We get way into the detail, the precision, the specifics of it, and it makes it much more effective. Because if you just say to somebody, are you doing turn and talks in your lesson? They'll say, yes. How's it going? Pretty good. We just don't get very far with that type of surface exploration. It's got to be much more precise. That's the idea of a walkthrough. It gives you a framework for thinking about your practices with some detail. What it isn't, not like a law. All of that is the rules. Those things are frameworks for thinking about a good process. And it's a good process if you follow it. But you might have all sorts of reasons to not exactly do that at any given time or with a particular class or a particular subject. We have to be careful not to treat a walkthrough as absolute truth or the rules you must follow or else. It's just, here's a nice set of ideas that will help you think about this technique in some detail and use it to self-reflect and to improve your practice and for coaching.
You said a lot there that resonated with me, Tom. No, I agree with you actually in terms of the obvious isn't necessarily the obvious because one, I've gone into many classrooms and recommended Think Pair Share and have found myself and the teacher also going to certain students and saying, do you have a partner? Especially if students are spread out
Yeah.
across the room because they're not necessarily going to take the initiative to get up and go, oh, I'm going to go walk over and find a partner. So, yes, I agree that there is nothing too obvious in teaching. And then you were also saying that walkthroughs is not necessarily quote unquote a law, and that sometimes you have to amend and adapt things for your audience. Another strategy I like, very similar to Think, Pair, Share, is think, write, pair, share, because sometimes students need that time to self-reflect beyond just think, where they're actually writing it down and then turn and talk to each other. I found that it sometimes helps ground some students that need that grounding. A lot of what you said resonated with me. And as you were talking, Tom, I was also thinking what I should have asked you is, how do you break up walkthroughs? Like in Danielson, we call them domains. I don't know how you break up in walkthroughs your different elements or best elements of practice. Could you tell us a little bit more about those different indicators of good practice? And for example, where would turn and talks fit within this model or this framework?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We definitely organize into domains. We have 6 domains in our framework. First one is behavioral relationships. Start off with establishing expectations and positive relationships, and techniques like positive framing, which I'm a big fan of, where you turn corrective language into positive language. Instead of saying, John and Tom, will you stop talking and listen? You say, Tom, John, looking, listening, thanks. Awesome, thanks very much. It's super positive. That's how you do it. You don't tell them off. Positive framing. So that's one set of ideas. But then we have curriculum. Before we get into the classroom, what's our curriculum design? So we have a whole domain around curriculum planning. There's quite a lot of walkthroughs in there, but they're slightly different from the ones which are like how do I do this step by step in the lesson? They're things to think about when you're planning the curriculum. It's quite a chunky section. And it includes establishing learning objectives for individual lessons, sequences of lessons, but also how you sequence the curriculum over time, ideas about difficulty. And then we get into explaining and modeling. You're setting out a set of ideas, how you explain things, modeling and scaffolding, the kind of input, if you like, from a teacher typically. The 4th section is to do with questioning and feedback. This is where we include think, pair, share. So questioning and feedback, the formative assessment, the in-class dynamic, responsive feedback, where you hear an answer and you develop it, but also feedback in a wider sense, marking book and other aspects of assessment are built into that. The 5th section is a practice and retrieval. So this is to do with memory and consolidation and testing, quizzing, but also practice, meaning, guided practice, independent practice. And the 6th section, based on my first proper teaching book, which is called The Learning Rainforest. The Learning Rainforest, I invented this thing called Mode A and Mode B teaching to capture the fact that instructional teaching is only part of a whole set of things you do as a teacher. It's a big part of it. But there's other things that children do to make a really nice, rich curriculum experience, like, for example, occasionally doing an independent project where they find things out for themselves through reading and study and research. That's not a way that you base your education around that process, but it's a thing that you might do occasionally, or giving a speech or a presentation to the class, or having a debate in the lesson, that type of thing. So all these sort of occasional set piece things you plan to develop and enrich the curriculum, which usually involve more student agency and then doing things more for themselves. That's called Mode B teaching. So there's a whole section in our walkthroughs called Mode B teaching, and all those ideas are included there. So that's the 6 sections. But I have to say, even now, because we've got 160 walkthroughs in our total set, sometimes I forget, is that in questioning and feedback, or is that in explaining and modeling? And then sometimes I can't remember where we put it because it's not hard and fast. They're categories to help you organize things, but they're not rigid.
And that makes sense to me as well, because as you said, the focus is on helping teachers to develop their craft in simple ways. It's almost, if you think about it, and I don't mean offense by this, plug and play, take the walkthrough you need when you need it.
Yeah.
If you are looking for more structure in how you question, take some of the walkthroughs from the questioning domain. And this leads to my next question, Tom. When a school uses walkthroughs, you said it's not an evaluative tool, that it is more for the teachers to pick up in terms of helping them to improve their practice in simple visual ways. Make it very concrete, make it very simple, very time efficient, but again, change a teacher's practice for the better. When you work with schools to integrate walkthroughs into the culture of instruction, how do you recommend schools and school districts utilize walkthroughs?
The first thing I would say is it's sort of 3 phases. There's training, then there's teachers tempting and implementing in their classroom, and then there's coaching, which supports that in the longer term. And the walkthrough is the framework to support so that all of that is coherent all the way through, and that the teachers aren't forgetting things, or let's say you have 50 teachers or 100 teachers or 1,000 teachers. If you're all talking about a similar idea, that idea is then replicable because you've got the same source to refer to and keep the idea intact as you're discussing everything. If I'm talking about, say, cold calling, and I just describe it verbally or act it out in a training session, 100 teachers will leave that room with their own version of that. That's the version they're going to think about. And that can be very different unless you've got something that you refer to, it sort of has codified that to some extent. And if you've got 100 teachers being coached by a number of different people, we want to make sure that there's a coherence to that. So when we're saying what's the cold calling like, we know what we mean, and so is a reference. The main thing we find benefits schools is that it supports what we call shared understanding of the idea. Your idea of it is similar to my idea of it because we're referring to the same source. And when I'm in a lesson doing it, I've got an idea. So in terms of the way is to start by showing people what it looks like as in a training session, hopefully live. We feel it's better to experience techniques and be part of a look at the walkthrough, explore it. There's a video of me explaining it. Try to do it in the training room so everyone present knows what it should feel like to do it. Then go into your classroom and practice using the steps. And you might even have resources in front of you to sort of remind yourself of what the steps are. But the main thing is, what's your mental model of it? See if you can mentally generate the steps. And then the third stage is when support that teacher through observation and coaching. If I come and observe you, and you say, hey, yeah, Tom, come and see how we're getting on with my cold calling. And I come in, I say, okay, let's see how it's going. You know what I'm looking to see because we've agreed it before it. These are the techniques that we're trying to develop. When we talk afterwards, I can say, let's have a look at how it went. And so the first step of cold calling is, well, ask the class a question so that everyone feels asked at the same time. So how did that go? Yeah, that was pretty good here. And that was a good example. And then the next one is give some thinking time before you select someone to respond. The thinking time, how did that go? Was that long enough, do you think? Third step, and so on. So we go through the steps as a kind of checklist of questions to ask. And it means that everyone having that conversation is getting into the detail. That's how it works. It works as a guide to the training, the teaching, and the coaching, and you do it in that order. What we find is if you try to skip the training, the teacher's just reading the book and having a go, they can be way off. If the coaches haven't been involved in the training, and they're not sure what it's supposed to look like either, they start making up everyone has their own versions of everything. That can work, but it means it's just less coherent and the conversations are less precise. And we're constantly spending time saying, what do we mean by that? Oh, I thought it meant this. Oh, I thought you meant that. But it's not about, here is the rules and you're not doing it right and you needed to have done this and you should have done that. It's not like that. It's the spirit of it is constant reflection tool rather than an absolute, which is why I feel it's really helpful in coaching, because obviously coaching has to come from the teacher's sense of things and you're helping them think and decide. We feel it's really good to seed that conversation with some ideas to think about. Have you thought about this? Did you think about that? As a teacher, you can reflect and say, it says that I should have maybe done that. Maybe I think I should have. Of course, you can throw in your own ideas and adapt them. We always say adapt every walkthrough. It says adapt, which means make it yours. It's your technique for your class. That means you have to think about the right sorts of questions and adapting it for certain learners and so on. We're keen that teachers own the techniques by deconstructing them and then reconstructing them in their own context.
That's very clear to me, how WALKTHRUs is a coaching tool and not an evaluative tool. With that said, when a school brings in WALKTHRUs, what is the admin's role in using WALKTHRUs?
Depends on the nature of an administrator in an American school, because they're quite varied in my experience. I've met admins who literally make sure there's teachers in the class and the buses are running, and so they don't really have any role in the instructional leadership at all. So it depends on who the admin is. Assuming they have delegated that to someone who is a lead of teaching. So assume that that's the role. The quality of teaching needs to be high. So how do I ensure that? Well, we've got some evidence-informed techniques in the walkthrough. If our teachers are teaching well, the chances are they're going to be doing those techniques. And how do we support them to do them as well as possible? So the admin's role is to make sure there is a PD program that is established in the fabric of the school year and timetable so that it can definitely allow teachers to have training and opportunities to reflect on their practice as they're going along, and to create a culture where lesson observation is low stakes and developmental rather than associated with evaluation. If you are also having teacher evaluations using the Danielson framework or some other framework, teachers sometimes are wary of anything else because they think, hang on a minute, is my pay based on this? Is my annual assessment based on this? And that can be stressful. So I think the admin's role is to really just say, look, okay, we're obliged because of state law or the district rules to do these teacher evaluations. We have to do that. It's not in my gift to change that. But what we can do is say, let's be really good at teaching. And let's also have a really smart coaching program And lesson observation there is totally free. It's not judgmental, it's supportive, it's developmental. And I think an admin's role is really key in that, because if teachers don't trust that, they think those observations are also going to feed into their annual evaluation. No one really wants to open up and say, hey, you know what, I'm really struggling with this. You need a culture where teachers can be totally honest about the challenges they actually have. And I think the admin role is key there. When I go into a school as a consultant and we work with the leaders, one of the first things we do is we look at the calendar. When do the teachers meet to talk about teaching? Sometimes it's hardly ever. You think, gosh, well, that's step one. What would it look like to do it more? Where would you find the time? If you're asking someone like, say, the head of the science department to go in, look at the teachers in their team teaching, when would that happen? Is it in their job role? Do they have time for that? And what happens afterwards? When do they meet the teachers again to talk about what they've observed? So we have to get into the details of the scheduling, because I'm a big believer in that. One of my critiques of the instructional coaching movement, it's too preoccupied with the interpersonal relationships that teachers and coaches have without first creating the framework for that to actually exist in a school. There's too many schools where instructional coaching just doesn't happen because there's not enough people to do it. There's not enough time. So that's, for me, admin's role. Make it happen, make it possible. And once we know it's possible, we can really finesse our culture and our relationship building. But let's make it realistic for teachers and leaders to deliver that. I've met too many people who are frustrated by coaching because it just doesn't happen enough. It doesn't really make enough difference because of that. It feels like all talk and no action. We want it to be productive, so let's make it really deliverable. Then once we know it's deliverable, we can hone our craft as a coach.
And I'm glad that you said that, Tom, because it makes sense to me as a coach how I might use a tool like WALKTHRUs to be consistent in my messaging. And we all have that shared language. And it also made sense to me how WALKTHRUs can be that coaching tool that supports teachers in their development in a non-judgmental, evaluative way. So if your jurisdiction is using Danielson as the evaluation framework, although I don't believe Charlotte Danielson ever actually wanted it used that way, just putting that caveat out there. But if for whatever reason your jurisdiction has decided that is the evaluative tool, you could still do what you have to do as an admin and evaluate using that tool, but coaching that you're providing teachers in terms of what quality instruction is can very well be WALKTHRUs. Like how you describe that, because it gives me a sense of how WALKTHRUs can fit within the overall instructional oversight movement, as you put it. How widespread the use of WALKTHRUs is in the United States. Where are you finding you're getting most traction globally in using WALKTHRUs? And what's going really well? Like, what are some of those stories out there of schools using WALKTHRUs that make you really proud?
Oh, wow, it's a great question. The UK is obviously our main place. Several thousand schools using WALKTHRUs in the UK. That's very encouraging. A lot of schools are international schools around Southeast Asia and the Middle East. They're independent schools, fee-paying schools, which is usually relatively privileged in terms of its resourcing and so on. The other big state system is Australia. So Australia, we've got 650 schools. Just before I was speaking to you, I was talking to a group of schools in Sydney who have just all signed up. There's 135 schools in a big group, and they're all joined, primary and secondary. And what they like about it is that it gives everyone a common language for talking about the things they were talking about already. They have these grand ideas, everyone does: equity and inclusion, safety, safeguarding, high quality instruction, independent learning, all these ideas. But often systems have these big ideas and they're not quite sure how to do them in detail. So how do I actually deliver that in a lesson? So the WALKTHRUs is a detailed toolkit which allows them to do all these really nicely thought out concepts and also deliver training on it across a big system. To focus on the US. In the US, it's been challenging. A number of reasons. District level procurement is curious. We have had a couple of big districts. So the most prominent one is Frederick County Public Schools in Frederick County in Maryland. They're fantastic. They're absolutely superb. They're very switched on to evidence-informed education, what you might call a science of learning. They have a central team of coaches, curriculum leaders who go into their schools across the district. And they've done lots of central training. They've mapped it to Danielson. They've mapped it to Rosenshine's principles. And so they understand how it works brilliantly. And I went into an elementary school, taught a grade lesson. And the teacher was doing think, pair, share, and cold calling. It was absolutely magnificent. And it was really great teaching. Every child was thinking, involved, participating. She was loving it. She was very excited about the walkthroughs and how it had helped to do the teaching. So that type of a system level thing, and that teacher's benefited from that training. And now there she is in the classroom teaching really well, feeling confident, and feeling that the walkthroughs had helped her shape her thinking. And that to me is what it's about. Ultimately, it's the children in that lesson loving their lessons and the teacher feeling supported by the scaffold of the walkthroughs. That's the exciting thing. Last week, I was in a group of schools in England where they've been using walkthroughs for about 3 years. And we're really into the problem-solving aspect, the hard yards of long-term school improvement. We can talk about coaching protocol. We can talk about the specific steps of the walkthrough and how you identify the right ones. We've just got this menu of options that we all understand. This is amazing. We can talk in this level of detail because we know what it is. And when they're observing lessons, do you notice this? And what are the issues the teachers have got? Signal, pause, insist. They need to really work on that step. It's such an important step, and it's so precise. That's where the action is. There's 2 levels of joy I get. One of them is when you've got a big system who are all using it together. And the other one is when you see one teacher with one class really teaching well. That's very exciting.
I think you need both. As a coach, I do like you, Tom. I get real joy in seeing something click for a teacher. But as I often say, but how do we systemically improve instruction across this building or across this district? Because whatever happens, let's say the teacher leaves, let's say the teacher gets promoted, you still want to have that culture of instruction embedded, that quality culture embedded in the schools. Tom, very quickly, because we didn't talk about it before, can you tell us what the Rosenshine principles are? After that, I have one more follow-up question.
Brak Rosenshine is a famous cognitive psychologist working in the US in the 70s, 80s, 90s. He published this fantastic paper called Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. Essentially, it's a kind of write-up of a summary of years of research about the things he observes effective teachers doing. So he used to go into schools with his team and say, what is happening in the classrooms where the teachers are getting good outcomes? And compared that to what is happening in the classrooms where the teachers are not getting such good outcomes. And he basically links that then to the cognitive science and says that there's no real conflict between, it's like what cognitive science says teachers should be doing. Guess what? They are doing. So what I love about Rosenshine's principles, firstly, is that he's not telling us what we should be doing. He's telling us what we are doing when we're doing a good job. It's the spring 2012 issue of American Educator. It's a classic. It's got lots of papers in it. And one of them is Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. That is the best short summary of effective instruction that I've ever seen. It's not original in some ways, but it's so clear. When I wrote about this, I took 10 things to 4. So one of them is reviewing material, regularly checking that children have reviewed material they've learnt before. That seems obvious enough. The second area is investing a lot of time in checking for understanding and questioning. He says effective teachers spend a lot of time checking for understanding in the lesson in real time and then responding to that, like going backwards or going forwards, depending on how the students are doing. The third area is breaking the curriculum down into small steps and modeling success, showing children how success, what it looks like to do a good piece of writing or successful maths problems, and scaffolding that so that children can be successful with help. So modeling, scaffolding, and small steps. And the fourth area is practice. So going from guided practice, so making sure all children are succeeding with a high success rate, with lots of help, and then saying, let's see if we can do it with less help. That's what you teach successfully. You make sure children can do it with as much help as that takes. And then you say, right, now try to do it by yourself, rather than saying, have a go on your own, and if you get stuck, I'll help you. It's the other way around. If you want everyone to be succeeding, that is. So that's basically what he says. It's really popular in the UK. I feel it's more popular in the UK than in the US, even though Brak Rosenshine is American. It's just a simple framework. It's just a really smart summary. And what I always say to people is, Rosenshine's principles is only a part of what you do, but it's a part of what everybody does. And there's not a single teacher who doesn't need to do those 4 things that I've just described at some point in their teaching. Tried and tested stuff. It's nothing sort of faddish or new, special. It's just good, solid routines, which you need to think about all the time.
I think there are probably a couple reasons for Rosenshine not having the prominence, even though, again, he is American, It's time of teachers, time of administrators. It's the focus on evaluation. I also think there's that disconnect between a coaching program and how you evaluate folks. Sometimes I think those two things get twisted up.
I think that's true. I also think there's a philosophical thing around the nature of education and what it's for. And what I found in the US is so interesting is how people who are talking about cognitive science or the science of learning and the value of instructional teaching are pushing against sometimes a sort of philosophical view that we should be empowering children to be owners of their own learning and self-directed and fostering creativity and all these things. And they see them as opposite rather than a means to an end. And my position was always that if you give children a solid foundation through instructional teaching, then they can be way more creative and be way more empowered through that. But not all teachers see it that way. And I've had lots of debates in the US, for example, about cold calling and the rights of children to sort of remain silent in the lesson if they're not feeling like it. And so when you're thinking, okay, but the cognitive science is clear that you need to think, children need to think to learn. And I would say a much more inclusive classroom, equity-based classroom is one where everyone is learning. And unless I'm doing what I can to make sure that the children are learning by involving them in thinking, involving them in talking, involving them in developing their understanding, I need to do some instructional teaching. Otherwise, I'm not being equitable. I feel that's a battle to be won in some people's heads. They don't like the sound of that. And it's an interesting discussion to have. I totally respect the need behind the idea that children should feel safe and included and nurtured. But at the same time, we can have high expectations of them. And I think the time will come. I think that, for example, in Maryland, I think they've introduced a law to say that teachers should be taught about evidence-informed teaching, about the science of learning as part of their mandated PD. And that's a good move.
I agree. When I recommend to folks that they cold call, I will also often get pushed back. Well, that's going to raise the temperature in the classroom and cause stress. And I said, well, it can, but you do want to raise and lower the expectation, the quote unquote stress level that they're trying something new, that they're stretching their learning. And then I also say there are other ways you could do it as well. Maybe give students individual whiteboards where they
Yeah,
write
of course,
their
yeah.
answer down and then all hold it up at the same time. Or you allow a quick turn and talk after asking the question before you cold call someone. And then you develop a culture in your classroom where mistakes are encouraged. You could always phone a friend, you could always ask for help, that it's not a big deal. We want our students to try. Getting the answer right is not the goal. The goal is, as you were saying, Tom, inclusivity, equity, that we
Yeah.
are a learning community.
This is where when you say evidence-informed teaching, this is studied, and there's a great study, a couple of studies, where cold calling introduced into a class, sustained for a month or so, and then you see the impact. Well, the impact is more children are confident to speak. They're ready to answer more questions. Girls speak more. Children with special needs speak more because it becomes normal to speak rather than frightening to speak and allowing dominant children to dominate. So you have to sort of give it time and create the culture. But once it is the culture and the norm, it's very supportive and worth bearing in mind. We do have to look at evidence where people have tested this to see what impact.
You were saying that you developed walkthroughs with this evidence in mind from cognitive science using Rosenshine's principles. How has walkthroughs evolved over the years? And in
Yeah.
what ways?
One of them is as a system. So when we first started it, we just had books and then we just made a few slides for training and then a few videos. Now we have this whole approach. It's involved to have a full wraparound coaching approach. In fact, we have a walkthroughs book coming out the fall this year called Coaching Walkthroughs. Everything is in it that we've ever thought about, all our philosophy about coaching, about team coaching. Basically, our total approach to running PD and coaching and linked to the techniques is in that book. We've gone from how do I do think, pair, share to how do I run a whole system. So that's one direction. The other thing is we've developed a number of different training modes. What we have now is we do a lot of training. We've developed some tip trainers, and we've developed this approach to training which is very experiential, so that you don't just hear about a technique. You're in it. You model it. You experience it. You discuss what the details of it are. And we feel that's quite exciting to actually have to sort of walk the talk and say, so let's run through our process and show people. So it's evolved in lots of different ways. We also have this toolkit called the problem solution tool. Now, when you have a lot of techniques, it can be a bit overwhelming. here's a problem, and it could be something like, how do I secure class attention? Or children are settling for mediocre work, or not everyone is involved in the questioning. And you sort of click on that question and it directs you to a bunch of walkthroughs which are related to that question. And it's helping people solve the problems they have. We've developed a problem solution philosophy, which is walkthroughs should be not something you implement because you should. You implement it because it solves a problem you actually have. Those are the sorts of things we're doing.
I like the immediacy of it, Tom, that here is the issue. This is the walkthrough I go to, because I
Yeah.
do think that that is a challenge when you look at frameworks like Danielson. It's much more involved to get to what you need. Good framework, very comprehensive, but again, I think they serve different purposes. Tom, what have we not talked about that you think listeners should know?
The main thing I'd say is, if you're interested in this type of thing, is I really would say, if you've never read Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, just Google it. It's a free PDF, just read it. Use it as a tool. If the evidence-informed world isn't something you've been aware of, go to a research ed event. These are the brilliant events. It's like it started in the UK, but they're taking off in the US. So next year, for example, there's one in Salt Lake City, there's one in New York. They're growing in popularity, and there's a whole bunch of people go to conferences and talk about these issues. And I think it's fantastic to be involved in them. So see if you can go to one of those, just meet all the other people who are like-minded and get involved in that world. It's great to talk to you about. I love talking about all these ideas.
And likewise, I could talk about instruction all day. So, Tom, where can people find out more information about you and the work that you do?
Well, the best way to do it is my website, I guess, teacherhead.com. So I've called it that for a long time, Teacherhead, swapping around head teacher, teacherhead.com. All my blogs are on there, and links to some of the walkthroughs. Or if it's the walkthroughs, it's walkthrus.co.uk. Either of those websites, and you'll come through to us. Or on X, I'm at Teacherhead. There's a great dynamic community of people in the US and the UK on there talking about education. So yeah, Teacherhead is the name for my blog and my handle on X.
And I will link to those sites on the show notes. Tom, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.